The Odyssey is Chris Nolan's latest film starring Matt Damon, Anne Hathaway, Tom Holland, Robert Pattinson, Jon Bernthal, and a bunch of other people that... Once again, Chris Nolan's movies continue to be hugely stacked. Most of his films in the past have been prime examples of that, and now here we are again with The Odyssey, an adaptation of the same name by the famous Greek poet Homer. If you somehow don't know the story of The Odyssey, if you weren't paying attention in high school or middle school, it's basically the story of the famous Greek warrior Odysseus and how he's trying to get home to his wife and son, running into all kinds of people and creatures along the way, while his suitors in Ithaca are trying to claim Penelope's right hand in marriage, thinking that Odysseus is never going to return home, even though Penelope is holding out hope that her husband will eventually return. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the mix, and it seems like on the surface it's a lot to cram in. I don't know how this guy does it, but I think it's safe to say he did it again. The Odyssey is incredible. That being said, the movie does start out somewhat rocky in the first 15 minutes, just to go right into it. And I know I sound like a Chris Nolan fanboy when I say this, but even if some of the ones that aren't as good as others, I still don't think he's made a bad movie. Some would make an argument for Tenet as actually being his first miss. I would disagree with that, even though a lot of it was really hard to follow. I would not call it a huge dropping of the ball, but others would say Dark Knight Rises deserves that title.
No, not a chance.
A good amount of Chris Nolan's movies are basically a giant spectacle with a solid story thrown into the mix. In this case, it's no exception. Whereas Oppenheimer was mostly a drama biopic, talking about the guilt of a man who basically caused, might as well, the inevitable destruction of mankind. This is more or less the same case in this situation with Odysseus, albeit in a very different setting and time period, where it's all about a man who has reckoned with the idea that he's actually a monster in the eyes of certain people, and does he actually deserve to go back home? And the other characters that are featured in here all play into the return of Odysseus and the idea that he presents to his kingdom in Ithaca, which I think is kind of wise to expand and explore these types of legends, because I think we as a people tend to look at historical figures and historical events through a certain lens, very clear, cut and dry, good versus evil, instead of realizing that the complexities of human nature are what makes history very interesting, because even though there is a good side and a bad side, when there's human beings involved, there's a lot more nuance and complexity thrown into the mix. And the film also effectively uses a non-linear storytelling mechanism, flashing back to certain points in the past, giving us the audience the idea of what Odysseus was experiencing as he was fighting in the Trojan War. And it's actually very similar to Batman Begins now that I think about it. We have the past and present working in conjunction with each other to create one whole narrative and character arc that allows us, the audience, to understand the headspace of said protagonist. And Nolan is no stranger to exploring the ideas and themes of time. Certain films like Oppenheimer or Inception or Interstellar are pretty big examples in that category, and even some of the Batman films he made, like Begins or Rises, and how it all connects to what's going on in the present storyline. I'll say this though, the first 15 to 20 minutes were a little bit rocky for me, because a lot of it was establishing of who's who and what's been going on for a certain amount of time. I was able to roll with it, but admittedly after a while I did start to say, okay, can we get to the point soon? But when we see Odysseus going on the adventure, the movie started to pick up steam for me, and when he encounters the Cyclops on the island, then the movie really started to take off. Now, before I talk about some of the storytelling and the characters, there's been a lot of talk about the casting of these actors, how they're mostly white Americans or British actors and they're not actually Greek. And of course, with people causing a huge fuss over the casting of Helen of Troy by Lupita Nyong'o, or the inclusion of Elliot Page as one of the soldiers serving under Odysseus. I don't really care about that stuff. This isn't the first time that we've seen a movie in a setting like this where all the characters speak English as if they were British or American. I understand that you want to be as historically accurate as possible, because in a movie like, say, The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson, the actual location in Jerusalem is what we now know in present day as Israel, and all the characters in that movie speak Aramaic or Latin or whatever was the predominant language in the region at that time. In that case, I would say it's perfectly acceptable. And also, does anybody remember the movie Troy by Wolfgang Peterson starring Brad Pitt as Achilles? Every character, and I mean every single one of them, speaks English, whether it's with an American dialect or a British accent. Well, mostly they're British accents, but there is some sort of American flavor in there. Yet people seem to like that movie, unless I'm getting the details wrong on that one though. And someone like Chris Nolan, who has a lot of clout in the entertainment industry, he's the kind of filmmaker that's going to get away with that kind of stuff, even if it's going to drive at least some historians out there up the wall. And it's similar to the casting of Lupita Nyong'o as Helen of Troy. I don't care about the race issue. I just care about if the actor or actress is good for the part. There's a group of people in these productions that are casting directors and casting agents whose job it is to find the right person that's going to have the right rapport or meshing with the people involved in the production. They haven't always gotten it right, but in comparison to some of these jackass vloggers who need to make a point about the casting, I'd rather trust a professional in Hollywood over somebody like that. And as for the inclusion of Elliot Page, if you're really bothered by somebody who identifies as a different gender than what they were originally signed at birth, you should probably take a look in the mirror sometime, because that shows just how insecure you really are and how you feel about somebody who's different from what your own worldview perceives it to be. Newsflash, life is not all Ozzy and Harriet. Okay, we're off the soapbox now. But when it comes to the cast, I think everybody is on point. And it's not just from the performance level, it's what Chris Nolan with the script is able to do with them. Matt Damon as Odysseus, I will admit, I was not really on board with that at first, but I was still willing to give him the benefit of the doubt because this is Chris Nolan, and he knows exactly what kind of caliber they're going to bring to any material that he offers. And I've heard some people argue that Matt Damon plays the character very one note throughout the whole thing. I would actually disagree. There are moments where he actually does let loose with his emotions, in particular with the siren song sequence where he's tied to the mast of the ship and he's basically screaming in agony over what he's hearing from the siren song. Which, real quick on that note, it's a really smart decision by the filmmakers to not show or give us a listen as to what's being said or heard by Odysseus. Because I've heard some people say this, everybody has their own desires and needs that they can't have. And it's going to speak differently to everybody. And even though the crew does put wax in their ears outside of Odysseus, one of them is able to hear the siren song and it touches something inside of him too. If you're sensitive to spoilers, I apologize for giving that away, but some spoilers will be discussed in here. Not absolutely everything, but there are some big details that I'll address. But Matt Damon is someone that I have looked up to as one of my all-time favorite actors for a long time. And I think in this situation, he is perfectly subdued, not going over the top with the crying and the screaming. And there's a lot of stuff going on underneath the surface. And the film does rely on him to show certain emotions in certain moments when it's required. It's very similar to Cillian Murphy's performance in Oppenheimer, where we can see clearly as the audience that all this crazy stuff is going on inside of his head. Although I would say Oppenheimer is a lot more crazy as far as him creating a nuclear weapon. Odysseus obviously doesn't have that situation on his hands, but there is some blood on his hands that he's been dealing with. The death of his own men, and the people of Troy that were slaughtered by the Greek army. It's nothing new exactly, because we've seen stories like this in entertainment and in real life where people who serve in a war for so long, they get so jaded and their senses are dulled significantly that when they finally go back to some sort of normalcy, they have a hard time reconnecting and they wonder, do they actually deserve to go back home? To be honest, I think the film does actually play on it quite effectively. And there's certain moments that occur throughout the film where he experiences the consequences of his actions, like shooting an arrow at the Cyclops, blinding him, which inevitably does upset the gods, since the Cyclops is the son of Poseidon, the god of the waters basically. They also run into Circe, who's a witch, turning Odysseus' men into swine, literally. That scene was unsettling to the bone. Once I saw what was going on and she was grasping the guys' heads and the practical effects that were used to make the guys look like they were actually turning into swine.
No, stop! Why this is no!
You know, I never actually thought that Nolan would get that freaky. The closest that I remember to that is the hallucinations from Scarecrow in Batman Begins. This makes that look like child's play in comparison. Outside of all that, I like how Odysseus was not an idiot. He was able to catch on to what was happening. And Circe was actually using the people that she encountered by turning them into animals, including the crow that's actually her sister, protecting her from any strange man coming into her home. And other people have pointed this out. The detail of her turning the swine back into human beings, she says as she's petting them, go back to your disguises, go back to your disguises. She's seeing them for who they actually are, which is a commentary on what war can do to people, at least some people, who allow their human nature to slip away, and they'll do anything to satisfy their own primitive needs. At one point, he even causes a mutiny among his men because of everything that they've experienced, and they get even more flustered with him as the film goes on when they find out that he's actually lying to them, that he was told to go a certain direction even though they want to go into the whirlpool. He leads them into this canyon of rocks, which some of them get picked off by this monster, and I can't remember the name of the monster offhand. But inevitably they get separated from each other in this storm, which is viewed as the vengeful hand of the god of Zeus. But as I mentioned with the flashbacks to the Trojan War and how they all play into the present storyline, what made it really click for me as far as Odysseus' character journey is that we finally get to see what he was seeing right in front of him as he was sitting down on these steps in the middle of the city. We see it happen a few times in the first 2 acts, and as I was watching it, I was wondering, are we going to see what he's looking at? And we finally get to experience that, and all the destruction and chaos that's unfolding right in front of him, and this young priestess in the middle of Athena's temple is what really weighs on him the most, which is why Athena, played by Zendaya, shows up in the form of that priestess that was killed right in front of him. And I think what really gets to him about it is that he didn't do anything to stop her from dying. Deep down, he would want to save her from being killed. He knew that was eventually going to cause problems among his men, as well as his leader Agamemnon, who is kind of this mythical figure of sorts, because we don't really see his face. I mean, we do see it somewhat under the mask, but really he's just kind of hanging around in the background, and there's a certain type of sound effect, or this musical piece where it's like, it's like this scary, eerie feeling, or this certain type of respect that the King Agamemnon exhibits. I have to say, the fight scenes or the battle sequences that take place, some of the best that I've ever laid eyes on, and it can only happen from the likes of Chris Nolan, who knows exactly where to put the camera, where to put certain people, and make you feel like you're actually there in the moment. And it's all due to the help of the cinematographer, Hoyte van Hoytema, who collaborated with Chris Nolan 3 years ago in Oppenheimer. And there's certain shots throughout this movie where we actually feel like we're there, like I was saying before, but it's all because of the lighting. It's not natural studio lights that we would usually see in a movie like this. At least for me, I felt like I was actually in this place, like when they're on the boat in the middle of the storm, in the middle of the night, mind you, and the only lights that we see are from the lanterns or the lightning flashes in the sky. Nolan is a very in-camera type of director. He wants to make sure that it's all real sets, or as realistic looking as possible, even if he does have to use some visual effects from time to time. And I'm not one of those people who prefers practical over CGI. As long as they can make it look seamless and tangible in the final cut, I'm personally fine with it then. But here, I actually felt like I was in the world of the ancient Greeks. The score, once again, by Ludwig Göransson. He's not Hans Zimmer, but this guy most certainly knows what he's doing. It's a very simple yet sound effect type of score, similar to movies like Oppenheimer or Tenet. Now, as for the rest of the characters when they're set back in Greece, Tom Holland doesn't have a whole lot to do at first, but at a certain point in the third act, in the finale, he actually does get to serve his purpose when he actually learns that this beggar is his father that he's been waiting for so long. And there's quite a few moments where he butts heads with Robert Pattinson's character, who's the head suitor, wanting to take Penelope's hand in marriage. And I find it really interesting that we have another Batman actor collaborating with Chris Nolan after Christian Bale. In fact, there's one moment that happens where we see Anne Hathaway, Robert Pattinson, and Tom Holland in the same scene. No joke, the nerd inside me was freaking out. Batman, Catwoman, and Spider-Man are in the same scene? Oh my god! But as for Anne Hathaway as Penelope, yes please. You know what? She actually might be the standout in this one because she's carrying a lot of hope and a lot of dread about her husband, while also dealing with these suitors that have set up camp in her home. And now that I think about it, they're kind of like the money changers that we hear about in the Bible, where Jesus flips the tables and says, I'm going to tear this place down and rebuild it in 3 days. There's a very similar vibe that I caught on to. I know this is set during ancient Greece, but I'm just saying that similarities were caught on by my brain, if you know what I mean. And she does let out her anguish and her grief in certain moments, not really sure if her husband's going to get back. And she also has to worry about her son possibly being harmed by the suitors. This is also her third collaboration with Chris Nolan: Dark Knight Rises, Interstellar, and now the Odyssey.
3 times a charm?
Yes. Yes.
I've also been following Anne Hathaway for 25 years, ever since she appeared in Princess Diaries. This lady has come such a long way, including winning an Oscar for Les Miserables, and she is the best Catwoman. I don't give 2 shits what anybody says. Robert Pattinson's role actually surprised me, because he's kind of played up as this tough guy who has some resentment towards Odysseus for wanting to go off and fighting in the Trojan War, and he's feeling some sort of desire for revenge to get back at Odysseus and take his place instead in Ithaca. And then when the third act happens, when all the fighting is going on, he turns out to be a giant coward, just waiting for the right opportunity to get the weapon out of desperation. Similar to Anne Hathaway, this guy has also come a long way. Used to be the butt of every joke in regards to the Twilight Saga, but now he's made it a point in the years since then to show that he can do other things outside of being a sparkly vampire. Empire, and now he's the new Batman. He'll never be able to escape Twilight completely, but it's safe to say that this guy has more than certainly proved himself. John Bernthal is also around as Menelaus, the husband of Helen of Troy. He and Lupita Nyong'o are basically small supporting characters that do serve a purpose in helping Tom Holland. I can't remember the character's name, but they give him some sort of wisdom, and they actually provide some context as to what's been going on with Agamemnon and where he ended up. And Lupita Nyong'o plays two characters, actually. The twin sister of Helen of Troy, who actually kills King Agamemnon. Similar to her part in 12 Years a Slave, she got me in all the right feels in this one. Just one moment, but it spoke wonders. Now, as for Elliot Page's character, he's basically the sacrificial lamb of this ploy that they're playing against the Trojan Empire by using this horse to get the whole city of Troy to think that the Greeks have surrendered. And similar to the narrative structure where we see the different types of time, Sinon is someone that's been haunting Odysseus for some time, and when he goes to the land of the dead, he actually encounters the ghost of Sinon, talking about how he felt like he was abandoned by Odysseus, and it's all part of the guilt and shame that Odysseus is feeling over the loss of his men. It's that usual survivor's guilt as I was talking about earlier, and how people of war are grappling with the idea of can they actually go back to a normal life. And that all pays off when he has to travel out west on the ocean with his wife Penelope in order to pay respect to his fallen men. That sequence was actually kind of freaky, but not nearly as freaky as the men turning into swine. But the land of the undead, and knowing that this is all about Hades, the god of the underworld.
Blast your hide to Hades, you meddling fool.
Oh my god, I forgot to talk about the Cyclops sequence. Everybody has talked about this is basically like a horror movie. If Chris Nolan ever makes a horror film, well, I think he already has done that in this one, but if it's all just horror next time, this sequence should give you an indicator of what to expect. And then some other adaptations of the Odyssey, which I actually did see one when I was in junior high in 7th grade when we talked about ancient Greece. There's not much interaction between Odysseus and the Cyclops. He's basically this giant who's just looking for food, even though he does talk by saying Poseidon's name. I like how Odysseus doesn't see him as someone that you can reason with, because he basically picks off all of his men. Do you talk to ants? No. So why should he talk to us? Or whatever he said exactly. The design of the Cyclops, if that's like a visual effect of some kind, where there's some sort of camera trickery that they use, I couldn't tell either way, and a lot of it is due to the lighting where it takes place inside this cave where it's in the dark and you can't always see where the Cyclops is. I was actually covering my ears because the jump scare sound effects and music that would come in.
I hate when that happens.
Another reason why I'm not a big fan of horror. And for anyone who may not know this, Bill Irwin plays the Cyclops. He was in the Grinch movie with Jim Carrey as Cindy Lou Who's father, the mailman. Blew my mind completely. Had no idea that was the same guy. I realize I'm kind of jumping around all over the place, but there's so much that I can talk about with this one, and I'm still thinking about it even though I saw it last night. By the way, I saw this in a nearly packed theater, about maybe 30-something miles away from my house, because every single theater within about a 10-mile radius of where I lived was all sold out. Otherwise, I would have had to sit in the front 2 rows like this. I did that 14 years ago with Dark Knight Rises, when it was nearly sold out in the IMAX theater I saw it in, and I was not about to do that this time, because when I did that, my neck hurt for about a week. Thankfully, the crowd was very respectful, and there was one person that actually started to clap in the third act when the big fight between Odysseus and the suitors went down. It really helps to see it with the crowd if they're respectful. And then lastly, that third act was something that I did not anticipate to go down the way it did. I was expecting some sort of big confrontation between two armies or something, but no, he actually sneaks in as a beggar, and how he reveals himself by tying the bow as offered by Penelope, and it's when he fires the axe, everybody starts to say, oh shit. It's him! Guys, I'm telling you, I was gripping my seat for practically the whole sequence. It's one of the best final battles I have ever laid eyes on. And I don't like using the subversion of expectations phrase, but in this case, that was a proper use of it. There's a lot more stuff that I'm not even mentioning, like the inclusion of Calypso, played by Charlize Theron, who keeps Odysseus there for a certain amount of time, or even when they're inside the horse, and because their legs are asleep, they have a hard time walking around sneaking up on the Trojan soldiers. And this was pointed out already by Chris Stuckman in his spoiler review, but the Trojan soldiers stab through the horse just to make sure that there's nobody inside, and one of them does get stabbed by a sword. Someone cleans off the sword to make sure that there's no blood on it, because if the Trojan soldier sees the blood, the whole whole jig is up. Odysseus' goodbye to Penelope and their eventual reunion, and how she's so overwhelmed with joy to see him come back. And I actually thought for a second that he was gonna die. But then when they show the two of them going off into the sunset on the water, they know because of everything that happened, and this has been pointed out by other YouTubers as well, they broke Zeus's law, and that the eventual revenge that's gonna come their way, unless they exile themselves into the wilderness, is the only way to stop any conflict from happening. And now Tom Holland's character, their son, can take their rightful place as the heir to the throne. On my end, it was a very bittersweet and satisfying ending. Oh my god, I completely forgot. John Leguizamo is in this as the, what I like to call the Greek sensei. Someone who doesn't have good eyesight, is actually blind, but he teaches Tom Holland how to use a sword properly. I'm not a huge fan of John Leguizamo. I think in certain situations he is funny, and he does have his humorous moments in here, but seeing him play a serious character for a change in a Chris Nolan movie, that is something I never knew that I wanted. Suffice to say, guys, The Odyssey is yet another stellar home run by Chris Nolan. If he somehow doesn't get any kind of Oscar nominations for this, there is most definitely going to be riots in the streets. Now, due to the success that he had with Oppenheimer a few years ago, that may or may not be a problem depending on what comes out for the rest of the year. But mark my words, there's going to be some kind of nomination for him with this. If not, at least for a Golden Globe. And I have a feeling that for years to come, this is going to be the quintessential adaptation of The Odyssey. This is something that you have to experience in a movie theater, IMAX or not. Anything Nolan puts out, you can bet my bottom dollar I'm going to be there on opening day. That's all I have for you guys on The Odyssey. Thank you all so much for watching. Let me know what your thoughts are on this movie down below if you've seen it. If you'd like to see more from me, just hit the like and subscribe buttons. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next one. Later!